Hi, we're going to go over sacral somatic dysfunction. I'm a second-year family medicine resident, been through all the levels of the complex. I hate how confusing uh, osteopathic medical school makes these types of problems. I'm going to show you my system of approaching it, which is consistent with what you'll read in Savarese and Foundations with respect to how to approach sacral somatic dysfunction. So first you have to determine whether or not it's a torsion or shear. When you're looking at whether or not it's a forward or a backward torsion, you'll determine what direction it's rotating and with respect to what kind of oblique axis. If we're talking about a torsion, shears, unilateral sacral flexion extension, those will be about a transverse axis. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. So you need to know what your seated flexion test is. You can be given it or you can derive it from L5 because we know that the sacrum is going to rotate opposite L5. So if they give you a problem that requires you to figure out the directionality of rotation and they only give you L5, that's fine. You just have to you have to remember that they're opposite. So oblique axis is opposite the side of the positive seated flexion test. So basically, when they tell you that your seated flexion test, for instance, is on the right side, then you can assume, if it's a torsion, that your oblique axis is going to be on the left. Okay. Now, we determine whether or not it's a forward or a backward torsion. This is going to be determined based off of our lumbosacral spring test. Sometimes they'll call it just the spring test, or the sphinx or backward bending test. Here's an important point. With the spring test, if the sacral bases, plural, have good spring to them, then that is a negative spring test. And you love it how in these problems everything's like opposite, right? Like L5 and rotation to the sacrum are opposite. Well, with the spring test, if you have good spring, then that is a negative spring test. Sphinx and spring test, they'll tell you the same exact thing. They're helping us determine whether or not it's a forward or backward torsion. If the spring test is positive, then we're suspecting a backward torsion. However, can't get your hopes up too fast. You have to also determine whether or not we're still talking about a torsion or if we are talking about a unilateral sacral flexion extension situation. So, for instance, if you have an example that says the motion or springing at the left sulcus is present, they're talking about one side, the left side of your sacral base, which can be described as a sulcus or a base. We're talking about one side here, not the entire base. So don't take this to mean that you have for instance, if you had good springing, that would be a negative spring test. Don't think, okay, well, negative spring test, I'm thinking about a forward torsion. In this situation here, it's important to remember that if we're only talking about one side, this is only letting us know what's happening at that side, not at the entire base. So you could have a finding like this and still have unilateral sacral flexion extension situation going on. So be careful when you hear a buzzword like spring, not to immediately assume that they're talking about a spring test. So, yes, I realize that this is kind of ghetto, but it works. So the diagram. This is your third step. Basically, the other important thing that they'll try to get you tricked up on is terminology. If the base or the ILAs are going a certain direction, they'll describe it as being posterior or anterior, but then they'll use different terminology. For posterior, they'll use shallow, prominent, superficial. They'll say that the motion or springing is restricted. All of these are describing the same thing. So don't let the terminology get you tripped up. Anterior, deep and motion springing, present, they're the same thing. So again, for the purposes of these types of problems, just remember that. Last quick note, sometimes you'll see a problem where they'll want you to diagnose what's happening at L5 based off of your findings at the sacrum. And just know that forward torsions follow a type 1 or a Fryette law type 1 situation where it'll be a group dysfunction where you'll have like the neutral, you know, it could be like L2 through L5, and then it'd be like rotated right, side bent left. The directionality changes. If you remember this little diagram where you have the N points in different directions. And then the backward torsions follow type 2 dynamics where you may have a single unit like just L5, and there you could be describing a situation with extension or flexion, but the side bending and rotation will be in the same direction. Okay, so let me put up my little diagram here of the different outcomes that you could have. So here's the possible outcomes. If you had a forward torsion, you'd have a negative spring test. You'd have a positive seated flexion, or a positive seated flexion test on the right. So the sacrum, you're going to like my little sacrum I got here. So with the sacrum is going to be moving like this. Okay? L5 can pin down this side because it'll be side bending against this side. It'll create a fulcrum, and then there will be anterior motion like this. So it's anterior going towards the left, so you have left rotation of the sacrum about a left oblique axis. Now notice that on one side of the sacrum, because sometimes you'll be given one side or two sides, and then they'll ask you, or you'll basically diagram things out. Just remember, every time you cross the sacrum, because this is a fixed bone, anytime you cross the sacrum, it's going to change from anterior to posterior. So when you're drawing out your diagram, I like to draw out all four corners. If they give you that the right sulcus is anterior or deep, you put anterior here, and then immediately you know that this is going to be posterior. And then you figure out what these two ILAs are going to be based off of other information that they give you. But just notice that on one side, it'll be anterior, anterior, posterior, posterior. So that's an important finding that you'll notice that is also consistent with the backward torsions. But in this situation, you have a positive spring test. Again, the findings are consistent on one side, posterior, posterior, anterior, anterior. Now, the reason I bring that up is this is also how you're going to help determine whether or not we're dealing with a unilateral sacral flexion. So, in this situation, if you look on one side, you'll notice that it's anterior, posterior. So on a single side, you have different findings, and that's important because you're operating about a different kind of axis. Here you're operating about a transverse axis and not an oblique axis. So you'll see with these findings, I can really quickly determine if I'm pressed for time without having to imagine what's happening at the sacrum as far as motion is concerned. I immediately know what my answer is going to be just by knowing what the outcome of the negative spring test is. I'm sorry, of this, finding out what the result of the spring test is, knowing what the seated flexion test is telling me, and then drawing out my diagram. So to give you an example, if we had a situation where you were told that you had a positive, excuse me, not as easy as you'd think using this little thing. If you had a situation where you had a positive spring test and you were told that the left sulcus is prominent or shallow or posterior on this side, then immediately what I would do is I would label anterior on the opposite side. And then in this problem in particular, they tell you that the left ILA is also posterior. So a situation like this, immediately I know that they told us that we have a left seated flexion test. So I put my axis here and I have consistent findings on both sides. So immediately I know that we're dealing with a torsion. And then I know that my finding here, the axis is on the right. So there's only two outcomes that it can be if it's a backward torsion. It can be left on right or right on left. And in this situation, I have a right torsion. So I know that it has to be left on right. This is without even thinking about, okay, well, this side is technically moving like this, and you know, you're trying to determine which corner is going to determine your rotation. You don't even need to do that. You know the outcome of the spring test. You know the seated flexion test. You know where your axis is. So immediately you know there's only two outcomes here because it's a torsion. You know where the axis is, and you know it's on the right side, so it has to be left on right, and it can't be right on left because the axis is on the right side. So if you think about it like that, it'll really speed things up when you're trying to move through exam questions, so that you're not having to, you know, use something like this or imagine something shifting and how it's moving. You immediately can deduce these things based off of the three things that you're going to do, which is know what the seated flexion test is, know what the spring test is, and then draw out your diagram. So hopefully this was helpful, and sorry about the situation, but I just wanted to present this for those who've asked. Thanks.